So I'm Carly Corlett. I'm your GBS Wellness Consultant, and I haven't been here to present for you guys, so I'm excited to be here today. And today we're going to be talking about mental well-being. So I've heard a couple comments that people are really excited to be here, but the whole point of this presentation today is really try to eliminate the stigma of what mental health really is. How many of you kind of have a negative perception of mental health or mental well-being? Anybody? Yeah, so a lot of us may not even know what that really means, right? So that's what I'm really going to be talking about today. And I do want to preface that I am not a medical professional. So today I'm going to be talking about a few mental health conditions as well as illnesses. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to meet with you and help you help answer those questions. But I do recommend that you go to your doctor and seek that support. So today, this is just an agenda of what we're going to go over. We're going to do a little mental health 101, what it is, different mental health illnesses and conditions, common but treatable conditions, how to maintain a positive health, workplace information, and then different resources that are available to you. So I like to have engagement. If you aren't too engaged, that's fine. I will move on. But what is mental health to you? Mental health, mental illness, mental condition, whether it's a word, a definition, does anybody want to share what they think mental health is? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, mental health is actually the state of well-being. So again, if you have a negative perception of mental health, I want you to change your perception to something positive. Similar to your physical health, we want you to view your mental health as something positive. It's when an individual can actually fulfill daily tasks and they're able to deal with the normal stressors of life. And a mental illness is when an individual has a condition that actually alters that individual to live their daily tasks. So whether it be depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, we'll kind of go into details about all of those, but it really affects their daily functions. So throughout this presentation, I want you to think of the dimensions of well-being. So mental illness obviously falls into the mind, body, spirit, and emotions. That's kind of the whole dimension of well-being, right? These four components. But what I want you to kind of think of as we talk about this today is that mental health really has a trickle effect of these different dimensions. It's not just your mind. So I'll use depression most likely as my example throughout this presentation because I think a lot of us are probably familiar with the symptoms of depression. We may know somebody with depression. We ourselves may deal with depression. So if you think about how depression affects you mentally and physically and emotionally, just as an example, just kind of think of those different components as we go through today's presentation. So it's important to know that mental illness is caused because your brain isn't functioning properly. Research is still being shown as to why certain mental illnesses or conditions happen. But it's likely that it could be family history, your genetics, your environmental factors. There's a ton of different reasons why a mental condition can happen. But what's important for you to remember is that mental illness has nothing to do with a person's lack of willpower. So if you yourself have never dealt with a mental condition and you see an outsider, say, who has depression, you may easily think, well, why don't they just do something about it, right? It's a lot more complicated than that, unfortunately. So it's important for you just to remember if you're dealing with a family member or a friend or even a child with these mental health conditions, that we need to view it as we do with somebody who has diabetes or heart disease. It's a condition that we really need to address in order for it to be fixed. So we're affected in multiple ways. Our brain has these different functions. And again, going back to depression, when we're depressed, it can alter all different thoughts in our mind. So does anybody want to give an example of how depression could alter somebody's mind with their behavior? So kind of with depression versus what they normally feel. Does anybody want to give feedback? Yeah, perfect. What about thinking? Anybody? don't care, or even to the point, what was that? Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the times that may not be their clear mindset. They may be thinking there's no way out, and they may be thinking of self-harm or potentially harming others. But again, one mental illness does not just affect one function in your brain. Similar to the dimensions of wellness, it has a trickle effect. So physically, you may be withdrawn from your friends and family, which could then alter your relationships. It could actually make you go more into a depression because you're feeling more lonely. So it has that trickle effect, and that's why we need to address it. And that's also another thing, is that mental conditions are hard to diagnose because there's not just a blood test that we can take and say, hey, your depression levels are at high risk, right? It's something that we actually really need to be vulnerable to and open up with the people that we care about, or medical professionals. And just again, going back to that domino effect, it can affect you socially, spiritually, intellectually, physically, the whole dimension. Just a few stats to resonate with you. Again, the reason why I really want to talk about this today is because we want to bring mental health in a positive light and bring it to your awareness, similar to how diabetes and heart disease is. Mental health is becoming a pretty hot topic, so it's important for us to see it not as something so negative. We need to be open to it if we have family members, or especially children who are dealing with this. So 1 in 5 Americans are affected by a mental illness in a given year. There's way more than 5 people in here, so just kind of think about that with just even in this own room. 1 in 25 have a serious mental illness, and 60% of all adults with a mental illness received no treatment. So again, going back to a diabetic, if they're not receiving their treatment that they need, it could potentially lead to more harm than good. And this is by diagnosis, so about 1% has schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is when an individual is not necessarily able to differentiate what's real versus emotions or thoughts or feelings. So that's when an individual is really hallucinating and they aren't able to function properly. 2.6% of Americans have bipolar disorder. Do you guys think that's a small number or a big number? What was that? A big number. Yeah, it does seem like a big number. And I think a lot of the times too, just as humans, if somebody's going through a week of different mood swings, we may say, you're just so bipolar, right? And so I think a lot of times people just use that term so lightly, but really bipolar is defined as someone who goes through manic episodes weeks at a time. So it's not necessarily just a day-to-day thing where they're feeling happy one day and then a little down in the dumps the next. It's actually manic and one extreme to the next from week to week. 6.9% live with major depression and 18% live with anxiety. So now I'm going to go in a little bit more of common conditions, which a lot of you may be familiar with. It's not like I'm going into detail with any rare conditions. But the good news is most of them are treatable. All of them are treatable, actually. So we're going to discuss depression and anxiety. And with anxiety, there's 3 ones I'm going to focus on. It's generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and social anxiety disorder. And then we're also going to talk about stress. So with depression, symptoms can include anywhere from not wanting to get out of bed to loss of appetite to fatigue to withdrawal, whatever it may be. And many of us probably know somebody or have personally dealt with depression. Depression is twice as more prevalent in females than men. And the average age of depression comes on around 32. And I actually thought that was incredibly high, but then I thought, well, maybe, baby boomers, I know that they deal with a lot of depression, so maybe that's kind of why that average age is a little bit higher. But from working at a benefits broker firm, and we're looking at clients' claims data all the time, it is so bizarre to see how many children from 17 and under have depression and anxiety. So I don't know if I necessarily agree with the age 32 being the average age. But again, I think that's something important. It's something that's becoming more of a hot topic or more of the norm, that these children are dealing with depression and anxiety. And depression is often found with individuals that have chronic conditions. 25% of those with cancer have depression. Of those who have eating disorders, does anybody want to guess the percentage of those who have depression? It's about 50 to 75%. So I know that's kind of a broad range, but yeah, up to 75% of those who have eating disorders also have depression. And it doesn't necessarily mean that cancer is causing depression or eating disorders is causing depression. These different chronic conditions could potentially be correlated to the depression that they've actually had in the past, so an eating disorder, for example. So just kind of keep that in mind. And knowing that depression affects us physically, mentally, emotionally, how do you think that would impact us at work if we were dealing with depression? Right. You may not be as productive. You may miss work because of it, right? This number is astonishing to me. U.S. businesses annually spend up to $70 billion, that's a billion with a B, dollars on depression and anxiety related conditions. So that's not necessarily just the medical costs, but that includes medical costs, lost productivity time, absenteeism. I actually think I read that $12 billion is actually costing U.S. businesses when employees miss work because of depression. So when employees miss work, it's costing up to $12 billion annually. So this is important, why we need to manage it. So when is it a disorder? It kind of goes back to that thought process. When things are becoming so intense that individuals really aren't able to completely do their day-to-day functions anymore. They're even thinking self-harm or harming others. And typically it's lasting longer than 2 weeks. So I think many of us can relate and know that we've all been down in the dumps, or the seasons change. A lot of the times after the holidays, people get what's called sad. And that's common, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that your depression is actually a disorder. It's more of just a little bit of a phase. And here are some symptoms. So sleep disturbances, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, even suicidal thoughts. And the good news is that depression is treatable. Research shows that 80% of those that went to seek support and treatment found improvements in 4 to 6 weeks. Now, improvements doesn't mean cured. I think depending on where you are or how depressed you are or anxious or whatever it may be, seeking support is just that first initial step, and it's just working on it. I think it's great that people found improvements in just 4 to 6 weeks, because in the long term, that's a really short time, and who knows how long these individuals have actually been feeling depressed, right? So that's great. One thing I do want to also stress is this doesn't mean that individuals just went to their doctor and asked for a prescription. I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but Utah has twice the national average of being prescribed antidepressants. So especially in Utah, that's such a norm. And I'm not saying that being on medication for depression is not the way to go. I know many people that are on antidepressants that have changed their lives drastically, and it was the best option for them. But one thing I do encourage is, if you know somebody with depression, or you see a child, still seek that support, but also look for other natural, more holistic routes prior to just resulting to medication. But again, medication works for so many people, but in Utah, it's quite overprescribed. Tongue twister. Anybody have any questions so far or comments? No? And always just remember this: difficult roads often lead to beautiful destinations. So with anxiety, so some anxiety is normal, right? We may have anxiety with public speaking or meeting a deadline or even being stuck in traffic, right? But when is it a disorder? Similar to depression. It's when it actually goes unmanaged and it's getting worse. Anxiety builds up over time, and similar to depression, it can interfere with your daily tasks. There are different types of anxiety, and the three I'm going to touch on, which are what I mentioned just a few minutes ago, are generalized anxiety disorder, which is the pretty common one, panic disorders, and also social anxiety disorders. So generalized anxiety disorders is when it's not just a week-to-week thing. It's actually when it's going on for months at a time, 6 months or more typically. And you can feel a lot of muscle tension. You may get knots in your stomachs. You may feel tightness in your chest. Anxiety is different for everybody, so that's why it's also important to seek support, whether it be a doctor or your EAP or even a local psychologist, whatever it may be. It's important to figure out how anxiety affects you personally. And similar to depression, it could affect all aspects of our life. So panic disorder is when somebody is almost just completely in this state of paralysis or disabled. They have so much anxiety almost that it just bursts, and there's no more time that they can just hold this anxiety in anymore, right? It's more of an unmanaged anxiety, and they go into this panic disorder or panic attack, and your body will have shortness of breath, you tense up, some people black out, whatever it may be. It's likely due because your anxiety to begin with is not going managed, and your body just freaks out and explodes like a volcano almost. And social anxiety disorder is what it sounds like. It's when people have the fear of being in social situations because they're fearful of being judged or embarrassed. Which, if you know somebody with a social anxiety disorder, that can be pretty tough for them, which could likely lead to other things such as depression, right? I mean, they're basically isolating themselves because they don't feel comfortable in these social settings. So it's unfortunate and could lead to other health and chronic conditions. And similar to depression, anxiety is twice as likely to happen in women than men. So stress. I'm not saying stress is a mental illness, but the reason why I want to talk about it is because stress can likely lead to chronic conditions such as depression and anxiety. If you don't learn how to manage your stress, it's likely that that stress could turn into chronic stress and turn into anxiety and whatnot. So it's important to manage. Does everybody think stress is all bad, or do you guys think stress is good as well? Great, yeah, I really like to view stress as a motivator. A lot of us have stress or view stress as a negative thing, right? But it's really just when the demands placed on us exceed our ability to actually fulfill those demands. So a good example of positive stress would be if you are buying a house, right? You have a lot to prepare for. There's a lot of documents. There's a lot of costs going into it, but it's also a really positive and exciting thing. But a lot of our times our bodies will perceive that as something negative. So there's different types of stress. The acute is really short-lived. That's what I like to kind of see as a fight or flight. So if you're driving and you almost get in a car accident, your heart can race. Personally, I can't feel my legs, and I think it's because I have so much adrenaline just rush my body that I'm not able to move. I freeze in the flight or fight. There's also the freeze, and I definitely freeze. And then chronic is when this acute stress doesn't, you don't manage that acute stress, and it turns into something more chronic. So similar to these other mental conditions, if you aren't managing it, it could really have an effect on your day-to-day life. It could affect family members. It could affect work, all aspects of life. And then the positive stress is the eustress, the nice stress. And then distress is that negative stress. So that distress is what leads to chronic stress. So the reason why it's important to manage your stress is because it leads to unhealthy behaviors potentially. Not just depression and anxiety, but it's also correlated to high blood pressure. You could overeat, but just as many people undereat or don't eat at all as those who actually overeat. So I think a lot of people don't realize that sometimes, right? A lot of people just say, oh, I'm just eating because I'm stressed. Well, just as many people are not eating as well, which is just as unhealthy. You actually weaken your immune system the more stressed you are and the more unmanaged that stress goes. So just a few thoughts for you to hopefully realize that your stress should be managed. So again, it's important for you to manage it. It increases your work productivity, and most importantly, it increases the number of happy and healthy employees. So overall, managing and noticing anxiety and depression and stress, it really can improve your overall total mental health. It can have a positive impact on it. So just kind of keep that in mind. And especially, like I mentioned, I see a ton of claims going through that are 17 and under that are dealing with depression and anxiety. And so we as parents or teachers or individuals, sisters, brothers, whatever we may be, it's important for us to kind of set that example and allow for these children especially, and even your friends and family, to feel comfortable with going to you and saying, hey, I've been sad for a really long time. What's going on with me? And instead of thinking, oh my gosh, my child is depressed, it's a lot more prevalent and common than you think. It just isn't as talked about as other chronic conditions. So I really just encourage all of you to just kind of be a little bit more aware of how this could affect the younger population. But it affects everybody. So how to maintain a positive mental health. So I'm going to touch on some of these, but this first portion I'm going to talk about is actually getting outside. And it doesn't necessarily mean getting outside and moving, but even just being outside has great benefits of your overall total mental health. When we get closer to nature, be it untouched wilderness or a backyard tree, we do our overstressed brains a favor. So we, these days, spend 95% of our days indoors. And what do you think we're doing when we're inside? What are we doing when we're inside? Yep, sitting in front of a screen, sitting down at our desk all day. We're doing all of these unnatural things for our bodies. And it's important for us to get outside and get in touch with nature, go on a walk, get up, get moving, whatever it may be. We are so deprived of nature now because that's just the way life is now, right? So it's our responsibility to really make it a priority to get outside. And there's great benefits with going outside. The next 3 or 4 slides are just touching on a few different research studies that measured the benefits of being outside, so just bear with me. This medical school in England analyzed 10,000 city dwellers, and they found that those living near more green space reported less mental distress. And then again, another research study showed that people who lived within just about a half a mile of green space had lower incidence levels of 15 different diseases, and of those diseases, depression and anxiety are part of it. And we are so lucky that we live in Utah. I mean, there's trees all around us, right? And especially up here, it's not as city-like as it is down in Salt Lake. You guys have a lot more nature, I will say, just right in your backyard, right? So it's important for you to take advantage of it because there's plenty of health benefits. And then in Toronto, 31,000 residents had mental health data analyzed, and they found that those living on blocks with more trees showed a boost in heart and metabolic health. And I thought that was funny, equivalent to what one would experience from $20,000 gain in income. So how many of you would like that? Then just go outside if you want that feeling. And so then this Glasgow study, I can't quite remember what the professor's name was, but he thought, okay, that's all great, but what's the actual correlation, right? Is it because it's the fresh air? Is it because it's the color green? Or is it because people live near outdoor, because they live in this kind of nature-friendly place, they're more likely to go out and exercise. Therefore, exercise is leading to these positive benefits. So he did a meta-analysis where he analyzed all these different research studies, and he also did his own, and he actually found that even those that just lived near, it didn't really have anything to do with people actually being physically active, but it was just those that actually lived near more green space or more parks actually just showed a positive mental health being compared to those who didn't. So take advantage of what's around us. And this next one is super important because sleep is crucial. As we age, there's that kind of sweet spot age range between 20 to 40 that we don't really need as much sleep anymore. But once we start getting past that, it's similar, just like when we were children. We need more and more sleep. But when I say restful sleep, what does that mean? Anybody want to give it a shot? What was that? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so good quality sleep, being able to fall asleep at night without sleeping pills or without tossing and turning, and actually being able to stay asleep throughout the whole entire night. Because it really does bring clarity to our brain. Our brain has these limits, believe it or not. I mean, from the second we wake up, how many of you check your phone, right? It's probably pretty common. And so just from the second we wake up, we're getting all these bits of information, whether it be our phone, the newspaper, work, interacting with coworkers. I mean, our bodies by the end of the day are just done for. And the term brain fried is actually a real thing. And that's why it's important for us to actually have this sleep, because I'm going to show you a video in just a minute, but it's fascinating what our brains can do when we sleep. And it strengthens our immune system, and again, clears our brain. So every cell in our body requires nutrients, and our nutrients give off these toxic wastes throughout the day, and our bodies have the lymphatic system, which then clears out the waste. It's almost like a vacuum that can just suck away that bad waste that our cells give off. But in our brain, we don't have a lymphatic system. It just is not there. So research has always been done to be like, well, how do we still have these cells in our brain? How do we then clear it? And it turns out it's actually sleep that's clearing these toxins. So that leads me to this video, and we'll see if it works. Maybe. It's coming from somewhere.
Change them on here a little bit, just.
tell you about what we found.
There we go.
So the brain has this large pool of clean, clear fluid called cerebral spinal fluid. We call it the CSF. The CSF fills the space that surrounds the brain, and waste from inside the brain make their way out to the CSF, which gets dumped along with the waste into the blood. So in that way, it sounds a lot like the lymphatic system, doesn't it? But what's interesting is that the fluid and the waste from inside the brain, they don't just percolate their way randomly out to these pools of CSF. Instead, there is a specialized network of plumbing that organizes and facilitates this process. You can see that in these videos. Here, we're again imaging into the brain of living mice. The frame on your left shows what's happening at the brain's surface, and the frame on your right shows what's happening down below the surface of the brain within the tissue itself. We've labeled the blood vessels in red, and the CSF that's surrounding the brain will be in green. Now, what was surprising to us was that the fluid on the outside of the brain, it didn't stay on the outside. Instead, the CSF was pumped back into and through the brain along the outsides of the blood vessels. And as it flushed down into the brain along the outsides of these vessels, it was actually helping to clear away, to clean the waste from the spaces between the brain cells. If you think about it, using the outsides of these blood vessels like this is a really clever design solution. Because the brain is enclosed in a rigid skull, and it's packed full of cells. So there is no extra space inside it for a whole second set of vessels like the lymphatic system. Yet the blood vessels, they extend from the surface of the brain down to reach every single cell in the brain, which means that fluid that's traveling along the outsides of these vessels can gain easy access to the entire brain's volume. So it's actually this really clever way to repurpose one set of vessels, the blood vessels, to take over and replace the function of a second set of vessels, the lymphatic vessels, to make it so you don't need them. And what's amazing is that no other organ takes quite this approach to clearing away the waste from between its cells. This is a solution that is entirely unique to the brain. But our most surprising finding was that all of this, everything I just told you about, with all this fluid rushing through the brain, it's only happening in the sleeping brain. Here, the video on the left shows how much of the CSF is moving through the brain of a living mouse while it's awake. It's almost nothing. Yet in the same animal, if we wait just a little while until it's gone to sleep, what we see is that the CSF is rushing through the brain. And we discovered that at the same time, when the brain goes to sleep, the brain cells themselves seem to shrink, opening up spaces in between them, allowing fluid to rush through and allowing waste to be cleared out. So it seems that Galen may actually have been sort of on the right track when he wrote about fluid rushing through the brain when sleep came on. Our own research, now it's 2,000 years later, suggests that what's happening is that when the brain is awake and is at its most busy, it puts off clearing away the waste from the spaces between its cells until later. And then when it goes to sleep and doesn't have to be as busy, it shifts into a kind of cleaning mode.
Great. So do any of you find that kind of interesting? Was that news to you? Yeah, it's kind of incredible, right? So that right there shows you how important sleep really is. Many of us feel like we can probably function on just a couple hours of sleep, but really physically we may be able to, but internally our bodies are just not functioned to do so. Can you guys still hear me? Okay. So another way to improve your mental health and well-being is by meditation. So meditation doesn't necessarily mean going in a dark room, right? And closing your eyes and being very Zen-like for 20 minutes. It really just means kind of quieting your mind and being in touch with the current moment and those around you. It brings your whole body to a state of relaxation. So I really encourage you, if you are feeling stressed, Just try to meditate for even 2 minutes at your desk, and it will do a world of difference. Those who regularly meditate have lower rates of hypertension, heart disease, and surprisingly enough, anxiety. And it's also just important for your brain. Like I said, we are constantly being thrown bits and bits of information constantly that our brain just needs a break. It doesn't just need a break at night when we go to sleep for 8 hours. It really does need a break in the middle of the day as well, or honestly, even hourly, if you have just 1 minute or 2 minutes to just focus or keep your focus away from what you are currently doing. Don't necessarily go on your phone and check Facebook for 1 minute. It means just close your eyes just for a minute, or even just sit, look at the floor, look at your surroundings, and just kind of quiet your mind. And meditation, like I said, doesn't have to be this hippy-dippy thing where it's, you know, just meditating 20 minutes quietly in a dark room and just with all these different crystals, right? I mean, that's not meditation anymore. Meditation is just even going outside and going for a walk. Being mindful, that's the way I like to look at it. Just being mindful and noticing your current surroundings and moment, that's equivalent to being the hippy-dippy meditator. There's also a ton of apps on your phone if you have a smartphone. If you're too scared or nervous to just do it at work, I encourage you to try it at night. On your smartphones, I personally really like the app called Breathe. It is just a few minutes of meditation, and there's different types of meditation. So you can actually go in and say, today I had a lot of anxiety, or today I actually was really happy. And you can just kind of say what your feelings are, and then from there it will just have a 2-minute audio meditation, guided meditation, for you to quiet your mind and become more aware. You should sit in meditation for 20 minutes a day, unless you are too busy. In that case, you should sit for an hour. So even if it's uncomfortable for you, I encourage you to at least try it. And nurture your body with healthy food. So what do you think that even means? The term "we are what you eat" is so true. And it is. It's hard to eat real food, right, or healthy food these days, looking at the cost of healthy food and the convenience of the not so healthy food, right? But if you really want to commit and do your research, you are able to find healthier alternatives. If buying fresh produce isn't necessarily the most cost-effective way, the second best would be purchasing frozen food. And then from there, if you're not able to do that, that's when you could turn more to the canned and more processed foods. But even looking in to see when different fruits and vegetables are in season, they will be significantly cheaper during that time of the year. So it's important to maintain a balanced diet, which includes sweet, salty, sour, pungent, bitter, and astringent. Does anybody know what the typical American diet consists of? Yeah, so the first 3. So we're lacking in those other 3, and those other 3 are the ones that are actually the healthy foods. So does anybody know what the astringent, I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right, means, like what you would be tasting? So do any of you like pomegranates? If you eat a pomegranate and you have that dry taste in your mouth, it kind of makes a chalky flavor in your mouth, that's what that means. So you get a lot of those from legumes, garbanzo beans, pomegranates are a great example. Even some apples kind of create that. So that's what that means. And of course, fill your plate with colors and flavors. Fill your, oh, sorry, thought we were going on to the next slide. So avoid those dead foods. So those dead foods are going to be the highly processed, canned foods, and more likely than not, the convenient foods. And of course, moderation is key, right? I'm not sitting here telling you to not eat unhealthy foods, right? We are only human, and we have to go with the flow of our day-to-day lives, right? But I just encourage you, if you find it difficult to eat veggies at all, start small and just say, okay, I'm gonna add carrots to my lunch today. It's just all about making those small changes in order to help reach a full lifestyle change. And eating more healthy foods or real foods will help your brain power and your mental health. I have this flyer up here. This is my favorite flyer from our wellness team. I think it's just so cute. But think of it as eating the rainbow. So eat multiple colors. The different colors in the different foods have different functions and nutrients for your bodies. So peppers are great examples. There's green, yellow, red. All of those are really nutrient packed, but each of the colors actually do something different for our bodies. So just be aware of that. And I encourage you to just try to fill at least your daily diet, if not every meal, with multiple colors. And I have different examples of what different colored foods could be up here. And of course, moving every day. Does anybody know what the recommendations are for physical activity? Yeah, that's great. So what does that even mean? Yeah, so it's really different for everybody, right? I mean, as long as you are getting a little bit of moderate physical activity for 30 minutes a day, whether that's walking or it could be running for 15 minutes, and that could be equivalent. You know yourself best, and what I really hope for you, if you currently are not physically active, don't just think that the only way to exercise is by running. Personally, I hate running. I've tried it a million times, and I will just never like it. So I have to find other methods, right, in order for me to actually enjoy it. Exercise and physical activity should be something that you enjoy, and it should go in line with kind of your goals in life. So if you have kids or grandkids, make being physically active and exercise part of something with them, whether it's going to the park and playing or running a 5K, walking a 5K if you don't like to run. Whatever it may be, just find something that works for you because it's unique to everybody. And I'm sure you have all heard that exercising releases endorphins in your body, and it helps us stay healthy physically, but also mentally and emotionally. And I think this is a really important one. So kind of going back to the beginning when we were talking about depression and anxiety, a lot of the times people withdraw and they become lonely, physically and emotionally. But it's important to have these loving relationships. Having that family support, friend support, it's just part of your mental health. It's important to really cultivate these relationships, even in the workplace setting. I don't know if many of you have ever worked with anybody. That could be a little bit of a challenge, but it's important. At work, we wouldn't just eliminate the relationship, right? We would have to learn to work with them. So any other relationship in your life that could sometimes be difficult, try to work through it similar to how you would with a coworker. Because with a coworker, you're stuck with them, right? And there's nothing you can do about it. View that as the other individuals in your life. Think of ways to work through it and communicate to really strengthen that relationship. And great examples would be doing the other things that make you healthy with your family members. So going on a walk outside, eating dinner at the table. I don't know how many people really still do that, but a lot of people just go sit in front of their TV or drive through a drive-through, right? And we're kind of losing touch with our family and friends. So it's important to still maintain those relationships for a positive mental well-being. And last I'm going to touch on is maintain a youthful mind. So it's always so fun to be around children and just hear the wild ideas that they have. And their number one go-to toy could be a rock or a stick, right? But we are losing creativity as we get older. And also just because it's kind of the norm, right? If you were to come into work and be overly creative or kind of goofy and childish, people may look at you and be like, okay, you're a little weirdo and kooky for me today. But that's because that's just what the norm is, right? So this next slide, I'm going to hope that you guys want to play this just a quick game with me. I think if Melissa has probably played this before at our, I've done that twice now, at our GBS conference, but Really, the whole point of maintaining a youthful mind is just to continue to be creative. Get your brain juices flowing, similar to how you would have a child. You want your children to be creative, right? And you want to hear their crazy, unique ideas. It's important for us to do that as well. It just opens this whole other portion of our brain that just allows us to be creative and, in turn, helps our positive mental well-being. So we're going to play a game. This is the end of the presentation, becoming more and more of a positive benefit, and it's a great one-on-one. I'm not exactly sure how your EAP is structured, but EAPs really are working to help do one-on-one, just kind of like a psychologist, right? You're talking to them. It's all confidential. Box Elder County isn't going to see any information. They won't even see your name using it. They just see an aggregate utilization of it. So I encourage you to try that out if you haven't before, and you'll even get wellness points for it. So try that. And again, if you want to ask me any questions about any of these, then I'm happy to talk to you about it. But if you have more questions or want support, I encourage you to go to a doctor and talk to them about everything. So that's really all I have for you today. Thanks for staying and playing the game with me.